Welcome to the Mediascope. Today we have an exclusive interview with a very special guest, Mr. Stephen Kinzer. He's both an award-winning journalist and an acclaimed academic. He has spent more than 20 years working for the New York Times, most of it as a foreign correspondent. And in fact, he was the New York Times Istanbul bureau chief. He is the writer of the books Overthrow, All the Shah's Men, and Crescent and Star, Turkey Between Two Worlds. He is also a senior fellow at Watson Institute at Brown University, and he is teaching a class on the history of American intervention. So, welcome, Mr. Kinzer, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Hoş bulduk.
So we'll try to talk about the past, present, and future of American intervention in the Middle East in the time we have. So first I want to start with the very recent Trump administration. So throughout history, United States has always wanted to be the leading actor in international politics, but Trump says America first, and he seems to oppose interventions. So how will the United States interventionist policy change under Trump, especially with regards to the Middle East?
I actually don't foresee any big changes. I think we are following certain lines of policy in the Middle East. We have been for decades, and I don't think that's going to change. There was a moment when it seemed like the circumstances were right for us to make a change in our role in that part of the world. Of course, our role there has been focused specifically on the Persian Gulf, which the United States felt we had to control for two reasons. First of all, we didn't want the Soviet Union to project its influence there. And secondly, we were receiving the oil that was the lifeblood of our economy from the Persian Gulf region. Now, at the end of the Cold War and in more recent years, both of those reasons have disappeared. There's no more Soviet Union, and the United States no longer secures its energy supplies through the Persian Gulf. Nonetheless, we haven't changed in the slightest bit our determination to police and control the Persian Gulf. So here's an example of how, even when circumstances change, American policies don't change. I think we've seen an intensification of some policies that always existed, like the favoritism for Saudi Arabia. But I think you're going to see that with Trump, what's more remarkable about our foreign policy is what stays the same, not what changes.
Okay, thank you. So before moving on the history of American intervention, I want to say that conspiracy theories are like a popular phenomenon in the Middle East, and Middle Easterns are known for their paranoia about the politics, especially regards to the United States involvement. So considering the long history of American intervention in the Middle East, what do you think about this?
I moved to Istanbul as the New York Times bureau chief after I'd spent a number of years covering Latin America. Latin America, of course, is the cradle of magic realism, and I always thought that I had been at the world center of conspiracy theories and fantasies in Latin America. Then I moved to Turkey, and I realized I was moving up into another league. So it certainly is true that in the minds of many people in the Middle East, many conspiracies are out there. On the other hand, although it can be dangerous to be too much of a conspiracy theorist, there's also the opposite danger. You don't want to be too much of a non-conspiracy theorist. The fact is that not everything is as it seems to be, and there are forces at work behind the scenes. Those forces definitely have shaped the U.S. relationship with the Middle East. So, yes, people in the Middle East tend to be conspiracy-oriented, and they often see conspiracies where none exist. They do also, however, see conspiracies where they do exist. And in the case of U.S. Operations in the Middle East, to be a non-conspiracy theorist would be to miss some fundamental facts of history.
Okay, so I want to move on with the origins of America's interest in the Middle East. So before World War II, the United States had little interest in the Middle East and was more focused on the Latin America and Asia and Pacific. So how and when did the US started to become interested in the Middle East region? And if you can talk about the process leading to the Iran coup in 1953.
Well, I don't know how many hours we have, but we can certainly write a number of books trying to answer that question. Let me try to condense my own view of it. I think American involvement in the Middle East came in two phases, in two waves. The first came after the end of the Second World War. Up until that time, the U.S. had very little interest in the Middle East, and the only Americans who had gone there had been missionaries, people that built schools or hospitals, and we're not trying to project American political policy. After the Second World War, as the British and the French began to withdraw from the Middle East, the United States stepped in to replace them as the dominant imperial power. We took over the role of being the outside power that would be the guarantor of a certain pro-Western order in the Middle East. Now, we had to enforce that order to be sure that popular movements did not rise up that would place in power Middle Eastern leaders who believed that the interest of their own country was more important than the interest of the United States. We had to maintain a cadre of leaders in the Middle East who would defer to Western leadership. That was the genesis of the Iran coup in 1953. Unlike many countries in that part of the world, Iran progressed substantially toward democracy in the period after the Second World War as a result of producing a government that responded to what the Iranian people wanted. Iran nationalized its oil reserves. This was a direct threat to the British, who believed that they owned those oil reserves, and also to the Americans, who realized this as a challenge to the economic system by which the world was run. So the CIA, in collaboration with the British intelligence service, organized a coup and overthrew the democratic government of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. That placed the Shah back in power, and he lasted there, as we all know, for the next 25 years. That coup also sent a message to other leadership groups, particularly in the Arab Middle East, but also in the whole wider region, in the whole oil-producing region. And it was this. The United States does not want democratic or popular regimes, because those regimes are going to challenge outside control of oil. We would prefer autocracies, harsh rulers, quasi-dictatorships or monarchies that would guarantee our access to oil. If you would try to impose a democracy, you would risk suffering the fate of Mossadegh. If you would like to establish an autocracy that would supply the United States with oil steadily, then you could rely on the protection of the United States. So I think that was the beginning. And it was this dominance of the Middle East that lasted through the 1950s and 60s and 70s. The second wave of American involvement in the Middle East came with the pronunciation of the so-called Carter Doctrine in 1980, prepared by Zbigniew Brzezinski. The Carter Doctrine declared that the Persian Gulf was of vital interest to the United States, and that we would actively use our military or other coercive power against anyone who tried to challenge American control of the Persian Gulf. That has led us into all the subsequent interventions, which have essentially been one long war. So in those two phases, the United States anchored itself into the Middle East quicksand from which it has found no way to extricate itself.
Okay, thank you. So I would say oil is generally a common theme in most of these interventions. So I want to ask, like, what's the role of the corporations, like the ExxonMobil, on the role of interventions? Do they push these interventions, do you think? And as you know, the Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, is the Secretary of State at the moment. So would that affect interventions in the region, do you think?
First of all, you cannot consider the modern history of the Middle East without considering oil. And you cannot judge or understand the policies of any major outside power toward the Middle East without factoring in oil. That's just a basis for understanding this relationship. I always thought that maybe the greatest misstatement, the biggest lie of all the big lies that came out of the Iraq War was the one told by Donald Rumsfeld when he said, "This war has nothing to do with oil," literally nothing to do with oil. So the exact opposite, of course, was true and is a logical guiding principle for relationships between the outside world and the Middle East. So oil is always a fundamental principle. Now, when it comes to American intervention, oil is just one resource among many that have led the United States to intervene in foreign countries. The larger principle is that developed countries, consuming countries, rely on flows of resources from producing countries in order to maintain their economies. And those resources are supposed to flow according to conditions and prices that are satisfactory to the consuming country. When those are upset, the world economy is upset because that's the ruling system of the world. It naturally means that there will be conflicts between countries that try to take control of their resources and countries that consume those resources. Now, the history of American intervention shows that the United States tends to intervene in countries where there have been problems between American corporations and the local government. In many cases, nationalist governments try to limit the amount of land owned by foreign companies, or try to impose tariff walls, or try to nationalize resources. That's what has happened in the Middle East and has been the cause of American intervention. So yes, problems between oil companies and governments have been the trigger for outside interventions repeatedly in the Middle East. As for today, it is quite a notable fact that the head of ExxonMobil has become our Secretary of State. I wouldn't necessarily think that was bad. Maybe these giant multinational corporations are more focused on getting things done, on transactional relationships, than they are hung up with ideology and pursuing ghosts of the past or fantasies of threats that are supposed to be emerging from geopolitical wells of hatred in the Middle East. In this case, however, Secretary Tillerson is part of a larger matrix, and I don't have the sense that he's fully in control of American policy toward the Middle East. I'm not sure who is, but I would go back to what I said at the beginning. The fundamental principle of American foreign policy is, and has for generations been, that the United States has to be the dominant force that guides the world. So far under the Trump administration, there's no indication that that has changed, and that applies to the Middle East as well as to the rest of the world.
Okay, thank you. So I want to move on with the examples from the history. The United States intervenes not only with the military coups and efforts to change the regimes, but also with interfering presidential elections in foreign countries. And I know that in the United States, the Russian intervention to the 2016 elections is a very hot topic. And I remember that you written an article on Boston Globe regarding this issue. So can you give examples of the United States interference on foreign countries' elections, and what were the consequences of it?
American interference in foreign elections is a very old and well-established tradition. In fact, one of the very first CIA operations was a major project to influence a national election in Italy. That was in 1948, only 1 year after the CIA was founded. So the CIA has interfering in foreign elections woven deep into its history and into its fabric. I can think back to the case of Chile in 1973, when the United States, for the second time in a row in Chile, poured large amounts of money into the Chilean election in order to prevent the emergence of Salvador Allende. As the Congress was about to meet to confirm Allende's electoral victory, the United States was involved in a coup, in a plot that resulted in the assassination of the commander of the Chilean military. The reason we wanted to have him assassinated was that he was refusing to interfere in the results of the Chilean election, and we wanted a military coup to prevent the emergence of Allende. So that was quite a violent intervention. I personally lived through and witnessed another one of these in Nicaragua during the 1980s. I was a New York Times correspondent living there. I remember clearly the 1984 elections. During that election, the United States was interested in promoting the idea that the left-wing Sandinista government was contemptuous of true democracy and therefore would not allow a free election. The CIA got the idea that we would promote an opposition candidate who would later withdraw from the race after it became clear that there were no conditions for what were thought to be a free election. That candidate was a Nicaraguan recruited in Washington. He was made an offer by CIA agents over lunch in a Vietnamese restaurant in Georgetown, asked whether he would like to go back to Nicaragua and run for president. We promoted his candidacy. At the right moment, he did withdraw from the election, and the United States used his withdrawal as evidence that that government was undemocratic. So it may be reasonable to be indignant at foreign interference in elections, but it would be disingenuous for the United States to claim that it has never done so.
Yeah. Are there any examples from the Middle East about interfering the elections?
It's a difficult question because there are so few real elections in the Middle East. We've heard reports about this. I don't know specific cases, but I think the American attempt to guide politics in many Middle Eastern countries is not based around elections. We are recognizing, I think, that elections are not the key to power in many countries, and therefore to guide politics in those countries or influence politics, other means rather than influencing political election campaigns are more productive.
Okay, so I want to go back to the current time and talk about the Syrian war a little bit. I know that it's a very big topic and this is a broad question, but can you tell about the the role of the U.S. intervention in the Syrian war and the emergence of ISIS?
I believe the United States missed a great opportunity to help avoid the catastrophe that has enveloped Syria. If you'll remember, the crisis there began in 2011 with demonstrations in the streets that turned to violent action. At that moment, the United Nations and the Arab League came together with the idea of a mediating process. They wanted to bring the parties together to see if they could head off a full-scale conflict. And they named a mediator. It was Kofi Annan. The first step Kofi Annan took was to invite all the parties to the Syrian conflict to sit down together and explain their position. This would not be a negotiation, simply an opportunity to bring to the table what each party wanted and was willing to accept and not accept. The United States refused to participate in that process. We would not send anyone to negotiate or discuss or even meet with anyone else, with any faction in the Syrian conflict that had not already announced Assad must go. What it meant was we wouldn't negotiate with the Assad government, nor with any faction or government that supported Assad, meaning no Iran, no militias. We would be willing to negotiate or sit down at a table with only people that were on our side, essentially. So, since the United States refused to participate in this process, it never began. Kofi Annan quickly realized that there was no way to begin a process aimed at peace if the United States wouldn't participate. Therefore, he quit. That was the end of that negotiating process. What the United States essentially decided was this. Awful as it is going to be to see Syria spiral down into catastrophe, it would be even worse to sit down at a table with a diplomat from Iran or a diplomat representing the Assad government. In this way, I think the United States made a terrible misjudgment that helped create the disaster that we've seen over these recent years in Syria.
Okay. So from the history, we understand that interventions have unforeseen consequences and they harm the target country and undermine the American security. And then there's a lot of examples that come to my mind, Iraq, Libya. So I want to ask, why isn't the US learning from its mistakes and repeating its interventionist policy again and again?
You've asked a question that puzzles many people in my business. Really, in the United States, there's no penalty for failure. No matter how many times something doesn't work, we keep trying it. Albert Einstein had a famous definition of insanity. He said insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. We're still arguing in the United States that even the Vietnam War could have been won if only we had done things a little bit differently. It's difficult for us to believe as Americans that there's some big project in the world we cannot accomplish. You know, Americans grow up with something we call the can-do mentality. It's a wonderful thing. It's what helped us build this great country. It helped us build our transcontinental railroad and invent the airplane and go to the moon. It means that when you set your mind to something and you work really hard, you can get it. But there's a downside, there's a negative, a dark side to the can-do mentality. It's the inability to realize that there are some things in life and in the world that you can't get, no matter how much you want them and how hard you work. If you want to change an entire political culture and the minds of an entire nation and get them to adopt completely new ways,
That's something that's very different. Americans are unable to assimilate. I sometimes think the idea that much in the world is beyond our ability to change. One thing I learned from living in that part of the world, the area around the Middle East, is that many people there develop a different approach to life from Americans. Americans are problem solvers. We see a situation we don't like, we decide what to do about it, we break down the challenge into parts, we resolve them all, we want to come up with an answer. People in many other cultures don't look at life that way. They understand that many problems in life and in the world are always going to be there. You are not going to solve them. You need to figure out a way to live with them. In some ways, I think this is a difficult approach to life for Americans to grasp. We like to solve. Americans do not like to understand things. We like to do things. And you cannot make political progress in the United States by saying the U.S. should do less in the world. A more modest and conservative and prudent foreign policy in some ways seems almost un-American.
Okay. Mr. Kinzer, thank you so much. Teşekkürler for this great conversation. So today we talked about American intervention in the Middle East with Stephen Kinzer. Thank you for listening and goodbye.